Hello, my name is Jean-Jacques. The inescapable proof that English Canadians have been exploiting French Canadians for the last 260 years is found in Quebec itself, where the tiny Anglo minority has always been much richer than the Francophones. Far from being strangled by the French-speaking fascist majority of Quebec, as depicted in the Federalist propaganda, English-speaking Quebecers have always enriched themselves by diverting the provincial taxes of the Francophones. The systemic anti-French discrimination I'm talking about is as obvious as the nose in the middle of the face. You can't miss it when you live in Montreal. As usual, I will prove everything I say by putting a very detailed bibliography at the end of the video so that you can verify by yourself every single statement I make. First, let's start with something totally obvious. The Anglos came 152 years after the French in New France, and they used brutal force to take the control of the country, of its economy, and of the wealth it produced. That being done, they used their armies, their police, their colonial governments, their judges, and their supreme courts to transmit their economic power from great-grandfathers to grandfathers to fathers to sons to grandsons to great-grandsons up until today. Nowadays, political correctness forces them to use more subtle means to get the same results. To be able to behave like a majority while complaining like an oppressed minority, the few descendants of the British conquerors of New France used propaganda to conceal their wealth and power by hiding among the hundreds of thousands of poor English-speaking immigrants who came from countries like Italy, China, India, or Pakistan. By manipulating the official statistics they produce, the Canadian government and the Quebec governments have been able to artificially reduce the average standard of living of the English-speaking community in Quebec. Contrary to a popular English-Canadian belief, before the British invasion of New France, there were a lot of wealthy and well-educated people in New France. We had nobles, generals, merchants, etc., who all lived in opulent houses but who were forced to leave the country after the conquest. They were quickly replaced by English-speaking people who, for more than 2 centuries, used all the dirty little tricks imaginable to keep French Canadians artificially poor. We were the workers and they were the bosses and the overseers. Their systemic racism has been so effective that despite all the economic progress made by French-speaking Quebecers since the 1960s, in the 21st century, the few descendants of our British invaders still control an enormous part of the Quebec economy. Just take a look at the astonishing proportion of purely British names that appear on the board of directors of some prominent Quebec-based companies and institutions. And don't forget 2 things. First, that we are talking here about the highest paying jobs of the province. And second, that those I call the British Quebecers are a minority among the 7.5% of the Anglophones living in Quebec. Take your time and read those tables carefully. If necessary, press the pause button on your computer. After 260 years, the economic legacy of the British invasion is also visible when we compare the high salaries paid to the English-speaking mayors of Western Montreal with the average Quebec mayor's salary, which is about $22,000 a year. Here again, we find many purely British names. The difference is even more striking when we compare the cost per inhabitant of those mayors' salaries with the cost of the Montreal mayor's salary, which is 25 times lower. 25 times lower. Check. The proof of it is in the bibliography. Another interesting example is given by the number of large hospitals administered by English-speaking Quebecers on the island of Montreal, with all the high salaries it implies. Despite the fact that the Anglophones are only 17% of the population on the island of Montreal, they do control 44% of its large hospitals. They even control one of the 2 mega hospitals subsidized by the Quebec government, which means that, here again, half the money is spent for 7.5% of the Quebec population. I remind you that the Ontario French-speaking minority had to fight a long battle to save the only university hospital that existed west of the Quebec border. Check, it's also in the bibliography. Now, let's talk about the Quebec school system. As you can see here, official statistics show that the Quebec school system favors heavily the institutions controlled by English Quebecers, from kindergartens to universities, with all the high salaries that go with it. The 3 English-speaking universities in Quebec receive 21% of the subsidies paid by the Quebec government and 39% of the research and development budget invested in Quebec universities by the federal government, and that money comes from Quebec. No wonder that the salaries paid to the English-speaking rectors of universities in Quebec are higher than those paid to the French-speaking rectors. It's astonishing but true. The rector of the Bishop University earns $100,000 more than the rector of UQAM, despite the fact that his university has only 12% of the full-time students enrolled in UQAM. It's important to mention that most of those expenses in education will eventually enrich the other Canadian provinces, since studies have shown that 2/3 of the graduates produced by the Quebec English-speaking universities will eventually leave the province. Something else, and this is probably the worst of it all. For 260 years, good and decent people like my father or my grandfathers have been insulted and scorned by the very same English-speaking Quebecers who kept robbing their taxes and who kept them away from the best-paid jobs in the province. Logically, those who rob should not be those who scorn. However, when we think about it, it is indeed quite normal. Why? Because human beings are fundamentally good, which means that those who rob you would be unable to sleep well at night if they didn't find ways to justify their regular little thefts. This is the reason why English Canadians used to denigrate their victims by joking about the squalid neighborhoods where they were forced to live, by calling them frogs, or by saying they were too stupid to understand orders given in English. Considering all the wealth, the taxes, and the best-paid jobs that have been diverted in Quebec to enrich English Canadians, is it really a surprise to discover that Quebec is still today the poorest province of Canada? If French-speaking Quebecers have been unable to defend themselves properly in Quebec itself, where they have always been at least 3/4 of the population, how can somebody believe the propaganda that says that Quebecers have been exploiting the rest of Canada for centuries? Come on, guys, let's be serious. The bibliography I promised you will appear on the screen in a few seconds. Please feel free to share this video on the internet. See you next time.